Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of CCIR Student Research Spotlight. I'm your host, Nell, and today it's a pleasure to welcome Tamanna, who is in her 11th grade in the south of India. And her project that she worked on with CCIR was titled Opium Cultivation in Malwa, Exploitation and Coercion of Indian Labour from 1780 to 1830. And she worked with Dr. Chandra Malampalli. Okay, so welcome, Tamanna. It's great to have you here. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing well.
Would you be able to begin by telling us a little bit about your project, summarising the key ideas?
Yeah. So basically, my research explored how the British colonial policies, as well as local intermediaries that already existed in India, basically capitalized on the economic structures to be able to sustain labor exploitation in Malwa's opium economy, right? It was looking at how Malwa's opium cultivation was essentially differentiated from the monopoly control that the East India Company had with Bengal's opium cultivation, and how the British still were able to levy their taxes to be able to essentially still exploit the laborers in the Malwa region despite not having direct monopoly control, and how they were able to sustain this exploitation with the assistance of really wealthy people in India, notably the landlords and the moneylenders there, to essentially trap these workers into cycles of debt that they essentially had to be able to be exploited in terms of cultivating poppy for opium production.
Wow. Okay. Fascinating. So much in that. What inspired you initially to take on this project?
I think first, I just generally have a very big curiosity when it comes to history. I always have. And coming from India, I think this is something that I've always done the British curriculum for my entire childhood while I was here. And unfortunately, for that reason, I didn't really get to learn much about Indian history. So when my academics weren't fulfilling that for me, I found it necessary to do so upon myself to be able to learn about my own history. And I think in general, just being someone who's curious about history, I think learning about colonial history is extremely fascinating. And for that reason, I kind of melded these two distinct features about myself to be able to come towards the idea of looking into India's colonial history. And then when it comes to looking at India's colonial history, we think about the East India Company, and we later boil it down to how they monopolized textiles, tea, and opium here. And I think opium is so incredibly fascinating because it's not a very simple commodity. It's tied into a lot of aspects, and notably addiction being one of them, right? So which makes it extremely sought after, and something that has a massive network behind it. And for that reason, I became extremely interested in wanting to do my research in this particular area of Indian colonial history.
Yeah, no, absolutely fascinating. And listening to you speak, it sounds like there's so many different branches that your research could go off on, and so much history there, and so many different angles you could take. So how did you kind of narrow it down? How did you find what it is you really wanted to kind of specialize in? And I wonder, is this a topic that there's already a lot of existing sort of research on, or did you find that it was you had to sort of pick something to go at yourself?
Yeah, so I think to answer both of those questions, it kind of works together in terms of the reason I chose Malwa specifically when it comes to opium is the fact that it's very distinct from the opium cultivation in terms of during this colonial period, right? Because it wasn't controlled by the East India Company. It was controlled by indigenous entrepreneurs. So it was people from India, people from Malwa, who were essentially controlling this opium cultivation. And because it was so very distinct, I thought, okay, this is a region that I'm gonna look into because essentially it created a competition for the monopoly that existed for the East India Company. And so I found that to be incredibly interesting to see how it was also in the hands of the locals that essentially put their own people into really exploitative standards, especially amidst a time where India was already, being very exploited and coerced in every other aspect, being under British rule. And then I think also I chose this topic because it was so under researched. There wasn't a lot of resource finding my topic. For me, when it came to doing my research, I had to look at a lot of papers that were about the monopoly in Bengal to then be able to find probably just a paragraph about Malwa and then be able to figure out where the sources come from there. So because it was so underexplored, I thought, okay, this is going to be really interesting. It's really going to feed my curiosity. So I definitely want to, do it in this region specifically.
Yeah, amazing. So just leading on from that then, how did you find that working with the professor at CCIR, and how did you find that the resources available helped you to kind of structure your research, and how do you feel like, what do you feel you gained from being able to use that platform?
So I think for me, for my paper, I definitely wouldn't have been able to do it at all without CCIR's help. And having Dr. Tamanna Nambiar was extremely beneficial in being able to get my paper to come to fruition, right? So because it was so unexplored, it also meant that a lot of the papers that did deal with that did have a lot of information about my topic were things that weren't publicly available. So that is to say, there were a lot of colonial records and government revenue records from that period, as well as research done by authors like Faruqi, which were not available to me as someone who is not a professor or a college student. So what helped a lot was having Dr. Malampally be able to scan and deliver sources from his university's repository, as well as other repositories, given his access as a professor and a lecturer at different schools. And because of that, I was really able to get a lot of the necessary details I needed for my paper to actually be substantiated. And it's not something I would have been able to do on my own. So I'm extremely grateful for that fact.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I suppose it's such that is the kind of the beauty of the program, isn't it? Being able to really work with these specialists. What was your relationship with Dr. Malampally like?
It was amazing. I first came into CCIR because I really also just wanted to learn about how I can do research properly. That's not something I taught at school. So I found it important to be able to learn how to do this properly, which is also why I did the one-on-one mentorship, right? And so Dr. Malampally was able to answer all of my questions when it came to doing that. And I think I went from having very minimal and basic knowledge into how I'm supposed to do research into something that is far more developed now. And he being able to get all my questions answered and also get a lot of constructive criticism, I think helped me mature in terms of how I'm supposed to do research, but also how I should think about research projects in the future. So I think it was a really great experience for me overall.
I'm so pleased to hear that. Yeah, I suppose there's two sort of strands of this, aren't there? There's the how to actually do research in the first place, how the academic system works, and then also your actual project and the kind of subject matter. Yeah, fantastic. So thinking about that then going forwards, how do you feel, I suppose, with your project that you've been researching, and it's a historical project, what's the kind of relevance of it today? Like, do you feel like it's been part of a broader conversation currently? And do you feel like it's kind of inspired you to go forward and do further research in this field?
I'd say in a broader landscape, I'd say it's important as people to be able to know about this kind of set of exploitative labor because it's not necessarily indentured labor, it's not necessarily slavery either, but it's still extremely and highly exploitative because these people were essentially put towards the task of cultivating poppy, which is a really tumultuous and extremely hard thing to do, and they were forced to do this in extremely horrible conditions, working in really hot climate and not being able to have the necessary protection to combat this type of stuff, right? And I think it's important to be able to learn that distinction and understand it, because I think most people don't know that this type of labor does exist and has existed. But I also think something to note is that when it comes to thinking about our period of colonialism, we do put a lot of the blame on the single party, which is the British colony, right? But I think still most of the blame does fall onto them, but it's necessary to recognize that their means of exploiting the Indian labor was sustained through the wealthy class in India. And that's something that was extremely shocking to me as well when I first did my research, because I was just trying to find one answer of it being, okay, how did the British exploit Indian labor? But it wasn't that simple. It was really just fueled a lot by the wealthy the landlords and the money lenders in India. And I think that's extremely relevant in learning about Indian colonial history, because I think that's essentially what happened across India. And it's not necessarily what happens in other colonies, but definitely is what happened in our like colonial period for us. So I think that's the relevance of the research.
Absolutely. No, it's very interesting. I wonder then, how do you feel like sort of carrying out this research and sort of framing it within a context of a culture that you've grown up in? How do you feel like it's affected you, or what were the kind of challenges along the way of the actual kind of subject matter, and how were you supported by CCIR through that?
So I think coming across this information was definitely really shocking to me, but also in our current political landscape is something that I understand has roots in like a lot of our history, given that our current politics is characterized by a lot of corruption. I'm not too surprised that our history was like that too. But I think navigating how I'm going to change my thesis from being solely about British exploitation of Indian labor to now it being also done by the local Indians. How they essentially exploited Indian labor as well was something that I needed the help of my professor, and I needed the help of CCIR to be able to navigate how I will be doing that shift and how I'm going to be framing that in my paper. And I don't think I could have really done that otherwise. I think I just would have been left shocked by the information and try to figure it out a lot slower. Yeah.
Sure. So what do you feel like you've learned as an academic, as a researcher? How do you feel like you've grown over the time of CCIR?
I think my biggest takeaway would definitely be that you should be willing to adapt and adjust your thesis based on the circumstances. And I think before you necessarily delve into a topic, do a lot of reading about the topic that you're going into to be able to construct a thesis that you think is going to be most relevant in your case. But it's always just learning about how to adjust, how to not necessarily be fixated on perceptions that you might be stuck to given your cultural circumstances and the background which you come from. It's always about learning how to change your perceptions depending on the evidence that is given to you. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's important in life, isn't it? Being able to be flexible and adaptable to, yeah. So how did you find the program sort of socially? Was a group of you in this history project, in this strand, or was it more of like an isolated kind of scenario? How did you find that element of the program?
So for me, it was just one-on-one. So I wasn't doing it with a group of other students. It was, just me and my professor. And I think for that reason, it just became it was very much rich in just exchanging a lot of evidence and exchanging a lot of understanding about the topic that I'm doing. So it became fuel just thoroughly by learning more and more and more with each session that I had with my professor. Overall, that's typically how my sessions look like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. What would you change if you could do it again? How would you do it differently?
Besides, I think, I think, like I said, not necessarily letting my background influence the initial thesis that I had, but I think also, you know, it's remembering that it's like a learning process throughout. So I think how I would search for sources when it came to the topic was extremely different than how I do now, because it's I don't think for my paper necessarily the Google Scholar method really works, because most of my primary sources just were government records, which I found, which I was only able to figure out throughout this journey of writing my paper. So I think when it comes to looking at, colonial history, or just history in general, I think you should always consider starting off looking at government records and then forming the rest of your sources based on that, because I found it to be extremely helpful. So I definitely will do that in the future.
That's interesting. Yeah, okay. I mean, you said you were attracted to the program because you wanted to develop your skills in research. Had you had any prior experience? Was research something that you'd come across at school, perhaps, or was it literally just an interest that you wanted to pursue?
No, I didn't have any experience at all in terms of delving into this level of research, which is why I chose to do CCIR, because I didn't find school to be fulfilling enough. Because, to be honest, as someone who really enjoys doing subjects like history, it's not, the textbook does not give you enough information. And so I think it's really, really important to be able to have the experience of doing your research on your own, separate from what you're learning in the classroom. And for that reason, I thought CCR is definitely the way to go in terms of, learning how to do my research better.
Yeah, amazing. I'm glad it was able to stretch you and push you to where you wanted to be. How did you find out about the program? What was your journey to getting here, and how did you find the application process?
I think I found CCIR mainly through a lot of the videos that come online, similar to the spotlight videos about how students are able to develop and work on their skills, but also just from hearing my peers also work in research. I think I heard that like CCIR has always been something that's benefited students a lot. And I think the application process was extremely like easy for someone who is extremely passionate about doing this, right? It's just, I don't know, for me, I was just like, I really want to do this, so I'm just going to push as hard as I can. And I guess that's what really fueled me into while I was doing my application.
Absolutely. You have to have the curiosity, you have to have the drive, and I think that's what shines through as well in people's applications. So, yeah, wonderful. What would be your advice to anybody considering doing CCIR?
I think they should recognize where their interests are and try to pursue it the best as they can, because I don't think traditional schooling is necessarily the means to be able to help you develop your skills when you go on to college. You're not always exposed to how to do research properly and how to also be able to work and develop your interests a lot more. And I think coming to CCIR is the chance for you to be able to delve into a topic of your interest, free from the constraints of school, as well as develop a lot of necessary skills and hone these skills to be able to move on to further education. So I think I would really recommend it for that reason. And any tips I would give them is just be really passionate about what you want to do. And I think everything else just happens when you are automatically passionate about the subject that you're interested in.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I think you're right. As long as you're following your interest and following your passion, you'll end up somewhere good. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. It's been really interesting. Is there anything else you would like to add? If not, we can wrap up and call it a day.
I think I'm good. Overall, I have to say this is a wonderful experience for me. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. And thank you. It's been really great hearing from you. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye.